In the fall of 2009, Naughty Dog stood at a crossroads that would define not just the studio's future, but the future of narrative gaming itself. The Santa Monica-based developer had just released Uncharted 2 Among Thieves, a game that had elevated them to industry royalty. For the first time in the company's history, Naughty Dog would split into two teams. One would work on Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception, continuing the proven franchise. The other would venture into uncharted territory, literally and figuratively. Co-presidents Evan Wells and Christoph Balestra made a bold decision. They would greenlight a second team to develop something new. But creative director Neil Druckmann and game director Bruce Straley had a different vision. Initially, the plan was safe: develop a new Jak and Daxter game while testing out the dual-team structure. It made sense. Stick with an established franchise while adjusting to the new workflow. But as development discussions progressed, the team realized they were trying to force Uncharted sensibilities into Jak and Daxter, creating something that would please no one. In a pivotal meeting with Wells, they made a decision that would change everything. They would abandon the Jak and Daxter concept entirely and create something completely original. For years, Druckmann had been thinking of an idea that would come to terrify Sony executives and divide opinion within Naughty Dog itself. He wanted to make a game about a middle-aged man and a teenage girl surviving in a post-apocalyptic America overrun by fungal monsters. There would be no treasure hunting, no wisecracking hero, no globe-trotting adventure. Instead, players would experience something darker, slower, and more emotionally brutal than anything the studio had attempted. The pitch was bold. What if a video game could make you feel the way great literature does? What if a game could break your heart? The resistance was immediate and substantial. Uncharted was a proven formula, a license to print money. This new project, which Druckmann had titled The Last of Us, was a gamble that could cost the studio everything. Post-apocalyptic games had become oversaturated. The industry was littered with zombie games, each one bleeding into the next in an indistinguishable mass of gore and gunfire. How would this be different? More importantly, why abandon a guaranteed success for an uncertain experiment? Evan Wells and Christoph Balestra, Naughty Dog's co-presidents, found themselves in an impossible position. They believed in their team's vision, but they also understood the stakes. The studio employed over 200 people whose livelihoods depended on making the right choice. Sony had invested heavily in Naughty Dog, and that investment came with expectations. The pressure to play it safe was immense. But Druckmann had an advantage. He understood what made stories resonate on a fundamental level. Born in Tel Aviv in 1978 and raised in the West Bank settlement of Beit Aryeh, he had grown up surrounded by the constant presence of conflict and violence. His family immigrated to Miami when he was 10 years old, bringing with him an outsider's perspective on American culture and storytelling. He had worked closely with Amy Hennig, the legendary writer behind Uncharted, learning the craft of interactive narrative through their collaboration on the series. Now, he was ready to push beyond what he had learned. The breakthrough came when Druckmann presented his vision with uncommon clarity. The Last of Us wouldn't be about zombies. It would be about love in a world that had forgotten how to love. It would be about the lies we tell ourselves to survive. It would ask players an unbearable question: how far would you go to protect someone you care about? And crucially, it would force them to live with their answer. Sony gave them the green light, but the approval came with a catch. The game would need to be ready for the PlayStation 3's twilight years, meaning the team had roughly 3 years to build something unmatched from scratch. The timeline was aggressive, bordering on impossible. They'd be creating new technology, new gameplay systems, and a narrative more complex than anything they'd attempted, all while the industry watched and waited for them to stumble. The development of The Last of Us began around late 2009, with a project codenamed T1 or Project Thing. Naughty Dog had always been known for pushing hardware to its limits, but the PS3 was aging technology, and what they wanted to achieve required miracles of optimization. Every frame needed to be fought for. Every animation, every texture, every line of code had to be justified. The studio divided into two camps, each with competing visions for what the game should be. On one side were developers who believed the game should emphasize action and excitement, following the Uncharted template that had served them so well. On the other side were those who aligned with Druckmann's vision of a slower, more methodical experience that prioritized tension and emotional storytelling over spectacle. The debates were fierce, sometimes spilling over into genuine conflict. Bruce Straley became the diplomatic bridge between them. Where Druckmann was the passionate creative voice, Straley was the practical problem solver who could translate ambitious ideas into achievable goals. Their partnership would prove essential, each man tempering the other's excesses. Druckmann would push for narrative beats that seemed impossible to execute in gameplay. Straley would figure out how to make them work. Straley would advocate for cutting scenes that were taking too long to develop. Druckmann would fight to preserve the emotional core of the story. The performance capture sessions became the secret weapon that would elevate The Last of Us beyond its competitors. Troy Baker, cast as Joel, brought a seriousness to the role that was unusual for video game protagonists. Here was a man broken by loss, hardened by survival, and deeply uncomfortable with the possibility of caring about someone again. Ashley Johnson, playing Ellie, had to embody both the resilience and vulnerability of a teenager who had never known the world before it ended. The chemistry between them couldn't be manufactured. It had to be discovered through hundreds of hours of performance.
I'm sorry about your daughter, Joel, but I have lost people too.
You have no idea what loss is.
But capturing that chemistry required technology and techniques that were still being invented. Naughty Dog partnered with performance capture experts to develop systems that could record facial expressions with amazing accuracy. They needed to see every micro-expression, every moment of doubt or fear or hope that flickered across an actor's face. The traditional approach of recording body movements separately from facial performance wouldn't work for what they were attempting. Everything had to be captured simultaneously, which created exponentially more data to process and integrate. The technical challenges multiplied. The game system needed to be sophisticated enough to create believable human enemies who would communicate with each other, respond to the player, and react realistically to threats. The infected enemies required entirely different behavior patterns, moving in swarms, reacting to sound, creating a horror movie atmosphere. Meanwhile, Ellie needed to be a constant companion who felt helpful rather than burdensome, a partner who would enhance rather than detract from the experience. No game had successfully balanced all these systems before. As development progressed into 2011 and 2012, the studio entered a period that would later be described with dark humor as the crunch. In reality, it was less a period than a way of life that stretched across the entire development cycle. The culture at Naughty Dog was built on an unspoken expectation. Nobody mandated overtime, but the work had to get done, and the timelines made overtime inevitable. Developers worked 12, 14, 16-hour days. Some would later report hitting 70, 80, even 100-hour weeks during the final push. Weekends disappeared. Families saw less and less of their loved ones. The physical and emotional toll was severe. People broke down. Relationships fractured. The attrition rate was staggering. 70% of Uncharted 4's non-lead designers would eventually leave the studio. Many burned out beyond recovery. Naughty Dog's leadership struggled with an impossible equation. They could ease the pressure and risk missing deadlines, potentially compromising quality, or they could maintain the pace and watch their teams suffer. The company provided meals, brought in massage therapists, tried to create moments of relief, but the fundamental problem remained. They were attempting something that required more time than they had, and the only solution was to work harder. The guilt of this decision would haunt the studio's leadership for years. They were asking people to sacrifice their health, their relationships, their well-being for a video game. The justification? That they were creating something truly special, something that could change the industry, felt increasingly hollow as the months ground on. Some team members would leave the industry entirely after shipping The Last of Us, burned out beyond recovery. Yet amidst the exhaustion and tension, something remarkable was taking shape. The game was officially announced on December 10th, 2011 at the Spike Video Game Awards, unleashing a wave of anticipation across the industry. Playtesters who experienced early builds emerged shaken. The usual metrics, kill counts, completion times, puzzle success rates seemed inadequate to measure what was happening. People were crying during gameplay sections.
Not a little mad late.
Oh my god! Oh, I support that decision 100%.
They were talking about characters as if they were real people. The game was achieving something that seemed almost magical. It was making players care. But as the game approached its final form, questions swirled around the ending. Druckmann's carefully crafted, morally ambiguous conclusion. Joel's decision to save Ellie by slaughtering an entire hospital full of people, including the doctors who could have used her immunity to create a vaccine, violated every hero's journey convention. He was choosing one life over potentially millions. He was lying to Ellie about what happened. He was, by any objective measure, making a choice that would haunt both characters forever. The ending sparked debate within the team. Some questioned whether players would accept such a dark conclusion, whether it would leave them satisfied or alienated. The philosophical weight of Joel's choice. The game seemed to suggest the Fireflies could have made a cure, making his actions truly unforgivable in practical terms, was unlike anything mainstream games had dared to explore. But Druckmann held firm to his vision. He understood something crucial. The ending wasn't meant to feel good, it was meant to feel true. The entire game had been building toward this moral collapse, showing how love in a broken world could become monstrous, how the instinct to protect could curdle into something selfish and destructive. To soften it, to provide easy forgiveness, would betray everything the story had been trying to say. The arguments were intense, the stakes existential. People questioned whether Druckmann's artistic vision was worth the commercial risk, but Strawley backed his partner, and together, they maintained their conviction. The ending would stand as written. Players would have to sit with their discomfort, just as Joel and Ellie would have to live with their choices. As the release date approached in spring 2013, the pressure intensified. The game missed its original May 7th release date, pushed back to June 14th for additional polish. For the team, this didn't mean relief. It meant more weeks of grueling work, more crunch, more sacrifice. The studio existed in a state of exhausted anticipation. They had poured everything into this project, their time, their health, their relationships, their credibility. Early previews had been positive, but previews meant little when the full game landed in players' hands. The industry was littered with projects that looked promising right up until they launched and collapsed under the weight of their own ambitions. The review embargo lifted on June 5, 2013, 9 days before release. The scores were unanimous and overwhelming, perfect 10s for major publications, critics calling it a masterpiece, a watershed moment for the medium. The emotional ending that had caused so much internal strife was being praised as bold, mature, and devastating in the best possible way. The risk had paid off. When The Last of Us launched on June 14, 2013, it sold over 1.3 million copies in its first week. Within 3 weeks, sales reached 3.4 million copies. By its first year, the game had sold 6 million copies, climbing to 7 million by mid-2014. But the numbers, impressive as they were, couldn't capture the cultural impact. The game sparked conversations about video games as art, about the potential of interactive storytelling, about what games could achieve when they aspired to more than entertainment. The industry took notice. In the years that followed, AAA games had began prioritizing narrative and character development in ways they hadn't before. The success of The Last of Us proved there was a massive audience hungry for mature, emotionally complex stories. It opened doors for projects that might have been considered too risky in a pre-The Last of Us world. The Last of Us stands now as a monument to what happens when talented people pursue an impossible dream with unwavering commitment. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest achievements come from the riskiest decisions, that the path to something extraordinary runs through discomfort and doubt and difficult choices that haunt you long after the work is done. And in the end, that may be the most honest legacy of all.